Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Compliance Deconstructed, brought to you by Simply Compliance with your glamorous hosts, Lorie Davis, Elvan Baker, and Jessica Zeff. And this episode's topic, we're going to be talking about GLP1s and the compliance, ecosystem, the compliance issues. Having a language problem this morning, but that's okay. All right, ladies, don't help me out or anything. The compliance challenges or discussions around GLP1s. And the reason we wanted to talk about these and we feel it's so important is because the use of GLP1s has grown so rapidly. And there's a lot of compliance scrutiny that's emerging over the use of this particular drug. And we're seeing issues that are appearing across the entire healthcare ecosystem. And it's really important as compliance officers and compliance professionals, we have our eyes on these particular issues. So things we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about telehealth prescribing oversight, FDA warning letters, pharmacy benefit manager cost controls, prior auths, fraud, waste, and abuse, and kickback risks. So all the old favorites. All right. So with that said, this is a good point to start with telehealth, because that's where a lot of GLP-1 prescribing is happening. So Elva, can you take us through some of the issues that you're seeing around telehealth?
I think one of the things that GLP-1 medication, at one point, I believe in one of our episodes, we talked about how it came about and how it's being used for different reasons than why it was originally researched and manufactured for. And one of the biggest reasons that is being used right now is weight loss. What do people want when they want weight loss? They want it quick, they want it accessible, they want it today. That brought on the ability to deliver this medication or prescribe it via telehealth. Nothing wrong with that from a compliance standpoint if it's done right. The problem is that there are entirely too many companies doing it, and we're not really sure if they're each really abiding by the regulatory guidelines that are set in service delivery via synchronous and asynchronous visits. So telehealth can happen in two different ways. It can be synchronous or asynchronous. When it became very fashionable to be able to order these medications online, most of the companies were doing synchronous, meaning you truly had to fill out your profile, submit insurance, submit pictures of yourself, health history,
Your medical
just a
history,
variety.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just variety of things. And then you would really set up an appointment with a live provider licensed in your state, have the meeting, and like a true telehealth visit and receive, if approved, the medication. However, where it has gotten right now is there are a lot of companies who are opting for the asynchronous version of it, which means the person fills out the intake form that goes to a provider either approves, 99% of 9 point of time they do approve. They approve, they
Okay.
prescribe the medication. There really is no discussion of why are you wanting to be on this medication? How is it going to affect you? Just a normal conversation that's supposed to happen between a patient and a provider is really not happening. And that's really concerning because one of the reasons why telehealth has been great since 2020, since COVID, is that the ability to reach providers who are not in your area, right?
Uh-huh.
Or, well, right now, when companies use the asynchronous model, they don't know who they're serving, and you certainly don't know who's serving you as a provider.
So is that a problem? I mean, what's going on here? I'm a patient. I want my meds. I want my GLP-1.
I'm on meds too, my friend. It's just not the one. I want a heavier dose of other things. But is that a problem? No. Much like everything else in healthcare, when things work out the way that it's laid out in black and white regulation, it is not a problem. It is a problem when two ends of the receiver and the giver are, again, the provider really does not know if they're providing services to somebody who is 18 or 16
Mhm.
or 86. Same thing for me as the patient. I don't know. I have to believe that the person who's prescribing the medication is a licensed provider. How many times do we feel that a patient who's going online to receive these medications go to their state, regulatory board website to do a license search?
I'd say none.
I'd say none too. So now we have a problem. Now we don't know who's prescribing what, who's prescribing to whom. And there comes the third issue, what? Because I do not have a synchronous visit with a provider and provider doesn't see who I am, and it goes to a third party pharmacy, which you guys will talk about that. I have no idea if that pharmacy is authorized to produce what they're going to send to my house now. So those are the problems with telehealth. When everything works out great, fantastic. But I don't think we would have a podcast if everything worked out the way it should.
Well, it sounds like, I mean, what you're saying is there are so many patient safety concerns wrapped up in
Mm-hmm.
this, in
Mm-hmm.
the telehealth segment. And it's not that all telehealth is bad. I mean, we're not suggesting that at all. We're saying that for GLP1s, though, the growth
Mm-hmm.
in the demand has exploded in a
Mm-hmm.
relatively short amount of time.
Yeah.
And there aren't necessarily the controls in place that maybe other telehealth might have.
Mm-hmm. And another thing, and I would love to hear your thoughts on how do they regulate, because again, I know you're going to talk a little bit about what FDA approved versus now why are we using it, the originals versus the compounded versions, and that's fine. But again, what happens? Tell me, how is it safe when a provider looks at a black and white and makes a decision on prescribing medication from a pharmacy that they also don't know? I bet dollars to donuts. They don't know the pharmacy. They don't know the potency of what they're prescribing. They don't know if the person is actually abusing this medication. They don't know what if they have somebody who has an eating disorder in front of the camera that would have been in front of the camera that's just filling out stuff. They want another 10, 20 pounds lost because clearly, they're suffering from another mental disorder.
And I get that. And that's not to say that all telehealth providers working in the GLP-1 space are behaving inappropriately. But I think it's important for us as compliance professionals to recognize the risks, right? And so if you're a telehealth provider, or if you're a compliance professional, how are you managing these risks? Are you looking at these areas? Are you looking at whether patient evaluations are being done appropriately? Are you looking at whether documentation is completed? Are you looking at HIPAA? Are you looking at the quality of patient evaluations, to go right back to your point, Elvan? Are you looking at, do you understand who's prescribing?
And where it's coming from. Yep, exactly. I mean, it is so dangerous from all corners to be doing this on telehealth. I love telehealth. I love it when I can, when I can see my provider, with the click of a button, and I don't have to leave home. And all day, all I want to hear them say, I prescribed you X. And I'm like, I call my husband, pick up X. I haven't lifted a finger. But it seems like this isn't one of those cases where we should be so happy that there is telehealth. I don't know.
No, I know. I think it's always a fun, there's always a balance to be had. And one of the things, and I don't know if you have any insight on this, Lorie, but we talked in our prep session about licensure issues. And certainly when insurance companies or health plans are paying for these drugs, are there issues at all around cross state licensure and who's prescribing and how it's billed? Is there anything to be, as a compliance professional, aware of in that space?
So I'm really glad you asked about this because historically, during COVID is really when we saw that telehealth boom and the members and the patients were logging on and talking to prescribers all across the country because the restrictions had been lifted. Now that many of those restrictions have been lifted, there is a closer scrutiny and licensure of providers in telehealth and around GLPs specifically, because there is so much increased scrutiny. And I will say, in particular, CMS and the FDA are starting to crack down and doing increased audits on these organizations. Several organizations have received warn letters telling them, hey, don't do that. And they are really trying to crack down to make sure that you're getting, if you're signing up to get a GLP, you're getting a GLP that is accurate, it's true, it's the correct formulation, it's not made with copycat ingredients. They really want to keep member slash patient safe. I use member and patient because depending on whether it's a health plan or a prescriber, you could be a member or a patient, but usually you're both. So if your prescriber is seeing you in person, however, you do typically have to fill out a pretty comprehensive set of documentation when you are seen virtually. So they generally get a sense of who you are. They may ask some additional questions to make sure that you're getting what you have signed up to get and not just being white carded, handed a GLP and sent on your way without understanding the complications and potential side effects.
Yeah, it's not bad necessarily, but there are risks, and we're all about managing risk. So, you talked a bit about the regulator. So, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that and the scrutiny, because I know you pointed out how much work the FDA has been doing in this space. So, Lorie shared a number of articles with us about the FDA's response
Mhm.
to what's happening in the GLP space. And the FDA has issued warning letters. I think they sent out 30 warning letters, according to Reuters. And they had concerns generally about marketing, about compounding GLP1s, drug safety oversight, and promotion activities. So let's go into that just a little bit more to find out, what it is that the FDA is really looking at. And they're looking at GLP-1s, but they're looking specifically around telehealth. So, just looking through my notes, the FDA has been sending out letters to about 30 telehealth companies over their marketing practices related to compounded GLP-1 drugs.
Mhm.
They're concerned about false or misleading claims, including suggesting that compounded drugs are equivalent to FDA approved drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, Zepbound, whatever it is. And some companies, according to the article, have rebranded their compound drugs under their own brand names. So
Mhm.
it's not clear who actually manufactured these drugs. And also, on top of that, compounded GLP-1 drugs aren't FDA approved, just to keep that in mind. There's other issues that they were worried about. So, things about selling unapproved GLP weight loss, well, selling it as a weight loss drug, period, when it's actually intended to help manage diabetes. They're worried about copycat. I think, Lorie, you used that word. It's the first time I'd heard of it. And I see where you're picking up on it. They're worried about copycat drugs. They're compounding, apparently, and I didn't know this, is only legal in specific circumstances. Typically, when there's a drug shortage or the patient needs a very specific customized formula. I
Mhm.
had no idea. So, regulators in general are really worried about the quality, the safety of these drugs, and the claims that are being made. So, some things that have happened again in response to that. So, there's a telehealth company called Hims and Hers. If you watch television, you've probably seen it. They stopped offering a compounded semaglutide pill because the FDA started to ask some questions, and regulators. So the FDA is actually threatening to restrict the active ingredients, whatever that is, that's used in compounded GLP-1 drugs. So things to keep aware of in this space. But drug manufacturers, because there's always drama, right? There's always drama. Drug manufacturers are pushing back. They're making so much money off of it. So I'd push back too if I really was like, wait a minute. So there's all this stuff happening around the FDA and the questions that are being asked and the scrutiny. And again, it's not that there's anything necessarily wrong with telehealth or with GLP1s, but it speaks to the lack of regulation and maybe the lack of controls in this space. Anything, Lorie, Elvan, that I haven't covered that you want to speak to?
I think the one thing I do want to, and I know we're going to get into it, is really around the type of insurance you have, because it could dictate what you're able to receive in terms of your medication. So in commercial and ACA and probably even Medicare, there is a list of medications. You're probably way more wide open, whereas in Medicaid and CHIP, I think you're a little more restricted. And if you have TRICARE, I think it's probably closer to Medicare because they have something called in Medicaid and CHIP a preferred drug list, which is a subset of a large formulary. Formularies, everything that can be received, but a PDL or a preferred drug list is a subset of that formulary. Really focuses on the medications that they will cover by insurance. In Medicaid, typically your copays and CHIP, your copays are significantly lower than if you have commercial or another closely aligned type of insurance, but it's not covered by the preferred drug list or the formulary. You are paying out of pocket. And these drugs are quite expensive. Some people can pay anywhere from $900 to $1,300 a month if they don't have insurance. And that's a large amount of money. I don't know about you, but that's a lot of money
Mhm.
out of the
Hmm.
average person's pocket a month.
That's a huge amount of money.
But I think that's why the whole going into compounded version, right? Because it costs less, but it's less
Costs a
regulated.
lot less.
Yeah, a lot less.
So are compounded versions covered by healthcare insurance? Probably not.
I can't say for sure, but my guess is probably not.
Okay. So it sounds, again, from a compliance perspective, there are so many things here to be watching out for. Clearly, the FDA is starting to think about, restrictions and greater controls. You're looking at, as a compliance professional, you're looking at marketing. How do you market the drugs? How are you promoting the drugs? Do you guys think there's a need for more patient education?
Yes, but then how are we going? Yes, the answer is yes, but the subject matter is a very tough subject. We're talking about weight loss. We're talking about there's just a lot that goes into that subject matter. It's not like any other disorder disease that the healthcare providers or the mass media tends to. It's just the conversation is tough, like, right, there was a point where at any given time there are really 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 bad diets out there that people find very successful because their desire to achieve something external is a lot more important than their desire to read the warning label. Am I don't know. That's just the way I
Yeah,
feel.
no, I get it. Well, I don't know how useful warning labels are. They're written in a language that you've got to have a degree sometimes to actually read. They're not really meant for your everyday person to be able to read it and understand it, which is a shame. I don't like it. I'm not a proponent of it. I do think the warning label should be written in plain English so that you're actually telling people the benefits and the risks of
Mhm.
using, different products. But that's not the reality that we live in. But I do wonder, I just would throw that out there because I don't know if there is a lot of education from some of these telehealth
No.
providers around the risks and the benefits. Well, they'll extol the benefits, right? But they won't necessarily mention, hey, by the way, This might not be the best fit
Yes,
for
and
you.
how are you going to have that conversation? That would naturally occur if, again, let's go back to the telehealth mode of delivery. If you're not having a synchronous visit where you would naturally ask those questions, because we all ask when we're prescribed something new, hey, are there any side effects that I should be watching? And that natural conversation that happens between a patient and a provider doesn't happen when you do asynchronous visits. That happens on a black and white answer these questions piece of paper. So I do think that the responsibility still falls on the provider and the clinician who has the prescribing power to educate the patient. And again, going back and saying, hey, I read your intake form, it says you're X pounds for this height. I'm really concerned, looking at you, I'm really concerned that that may not be a good reflection. If you take it without needing this may happen. Like, those are natural conversations that any good provider would have if they are put in the right environment. And to me, intake form review prescribe is not the right course of events for that to take place.
Okay. I mean, there's a lot, we still have a lot of ground to cover, ladies. So I'm going to move us on. And I really want to talk about the pharmacy benefit management and the compliance issues around there. Lorie, could you tell us more about what's going on in the PBM space with these GLP1s?
Yeah, there's a lot going on in this space. So again, pharmacy benefit managers, or more affectionately known as PBMs, they are typically hired by insurance plans and insurance companies to manage the cost and utilization of drugs, and in particular here, those GLP-1 medications. So some of the PBMs you're probably familiar with include CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, or Optum RX. There's countless other ones, but those are the three big ones that we hear a lot about. So things that PBMs are trying to do, where compliance needs to kind of have an eye on things, is there are typically manufacturer rebates and discounts that are offered around GLP-1s. So that's an area of concern. They create those formularies and preferred drug list in partnership with states and health plans and health insurers, to make sure drugs are covered, which drugs are covered. So from a compliance perspective, you want to think about making sure that it's not overly restrictive, and that if it's got onto the formulary, onto the PDL, how does that work? And how does the appeal process work if someone wants something that's not covered, etc. And then making sure that you've got the clinical criteria to ensure that things get prescribed appropriately, as Elvan talked about earlier when we were talking about telehealth. And PBMs may try and get things over to those preferred medications over other ones because of cost concerns. So you need to make sure that your PBM is providing a lot of transparency into their rebates, their fee structures, and pricing, which can be incredibly difficult if you've ever worked with a PBM. And regulators are starting to come to the table, as I mentioned, because they're concerned about those rebates and those discounts and the formulary placement and which drugs are getting on and which ones aren't, and the intersection of a rebate and a discount and the formulary. So you really need to be thinking about that. Some other things that you may hear is prior authorization. Many times, if a drug is on a preferred drug list from a formulary, it will not require prior authorization. However, many GLPs have not made it to the preferred drug list or the PDL, so they're going to require a prior authorization. And often, when there are drugs involved, they have something called step therapy, where they want you to try one prescription before you go to another, given cost and side effects and other complications. So things that they want you to think about is modifying your lifestyle before you get to a GLP-1, an oral medication. They may put you on something other than a GLP-1 because there's other medications out there. and they may step up to a GLP-1 if everything else fails. But from a compliance standpoint, you need to make sure that it's not overly restrictive for members. It doesn't trigger an up trend in appeals and grievances and complaints. And again, back to Elvan, making sure that people aren't prescribing this drug when it's not clinically appropriate. So you may need to talk to your program integrity or your fraud, waste, and abuse team to work hand in hand to make sure that there isn't a doctor who's just writing these GLPs like candy and making sure that they're truly following the clinical necessity.
Yeah, so the GLP-1 conversation affects all part of the healthcare ecosystem. We spent a lot of time talking about telehealth and the risks there, but equally, health plans, health insurers, other providers, they experience, similar risks or even other risks. And let's go back. You started to talk about prior authorizations, which is superb. But let's talk about what's going on here. So, why have prior auths in the first place? So the reason for this is that at the moment, GLP-1s are some of the most expensive drugs on the market right now. And so typically, health insurers or payers, they put these prior auths in place. So number one, to control the costs. These GLPs, I think we said, they're really expensive. They can be between $900 to $1,300 roughly per month. So they cost a lot of money. And payers want to make sure that actually, if they're going to spend this money, there's actually a good clinical reason, right? So you also have a prior auth because these are being prescribed so heavily. And as Lorie said, you don't want to be prescribing like candy. You don't want to start prescribing GLP-1s like candy. So prior auths are a control mechanism. There's a lot of limited coverage for the use of GLP-1 for obesity rather than for diabetes. So again, coming back to patient safety and, appropriate clinical care. And also payers are using these prior auths to prevent off-label or cosmetic use. So there are a lot of reasons that insurers and payers are using these prior auths to begin with. And they want to make sure that patients are meeting clinical eligibility criteria, the drug is medically necessary, and that, as Lorie says, less expensive therapies that might even be more appropriate for the patient, like step therapy, have been attempted first. So these are the reasons why we might be using a prior auth in the first place. So what actually happens? How does that work, that prior authorization? What are these requirements like? So normally there's, a patient gets a confirmation of a diagnosis. They are at risk or they have type 2 diabetes or they have obesity with a certain, confirmed by a BMI threshold that's documented. So the BMI has got to be greater than or equal to 30 or greater than or equal to 27 with comorbidities. There's usually the patient has tried some sort of lifestyle modification or other medication before going on to GLP-1s. And then there's clinical documentation, making sure that the labs are documented, the weight history is documented, any comorbidities are documented. There has to be a treatment plan in place and follow-up monitoring. So this is kind of what the prior auth process looks like. In order to get that prior authorization, you've got to have all these other pieces in place. Now, what are some of the ladies I'd like to dive into a little bit around, for compliance professionals, understanding that background around prior authorizations? So what are some of the risks that are involved in those prior documentations? So some of the things that we were talking about as we were prepping are things like some payers covering GLP drugs for diabetes, but not obesity. So that can be a challenge because providers could then code for diabetes to get approval when the patient actually doesn't have it. The compliance implications then are False Claims Act, misrepresentation of medical necessity, a problem when you get to documentation audits. So these are all the things around compliance risks that have to do around prior authorization. Um, and also things about, maybe manipulating the documentation, saying, a patient has a greater BMI than they do, maybe not completing the information that they need to complete in the patient record, maybe using generic template language instead of individualized clinical documentation. I mean, these are issues and risks that we talk about generally in the compliance field, but it's all escalated with the enthusiasm around GLP1s. So what are any other risks that we want people to be aware of when it comes to the prior authorization process or the effects of the prior authorization process?
I would think that we would want to make sure that our friends that are prescribing, as well as the clinical folks on the health plan side, are making sure that their documentation is in order. If they have to obtain a prior authorization, if we're asking for step therapy, making sure those other steps are all documented, making sure that on the other side for patients, we want to make sure that they've got informed consent, that their doctor is talking through with them appropriate risks and side effects of using a GLP-1. There's still a lot that isn't known and things that are coming up. So I think we need to make sure that that is documented as well. That if you're audited, they're going to want to know, hey, was this documented? Did we follow the proper procedures? We make sure that, refill consistency is appropriate as well.
Well, I was going to ask you, does that monitoring stop at the prescription phase?
No. You want to make sure, and there are guardrails in place already where you're trying to refill too soon. They want, if it's a 30-day prescription, you can't go in 2 weeks in and try and refill, right? That you have to, so there is that guardrail that's typically in place regardless of line of business. But that is also something you want to try and watch from a fraud, waste, and abuse perspective.
Okay, which is, I mean, I wanted to talk a bit about fraud, waste, and abuse. I mean, and I touched on it a little bit. You can't get away from it when you're talking about prior authorizations. But are there other risks we should be aware of as compliance professionals for fraud, waste, and abuse?
Yeah, I think Elvan, you touched a little bit on it earlier when you were talking about telehealth, and that's the minimal patient evaluation before prescribing, right? That person that doesn't get to know you and they're just like, here you go. And they don't know your background, they don't know your story, and they don't try to get it, more importantly. Making sure that telehealth providers aren't overly prescribing it, or any provider, not just telehealth, any provider. So you want to look at those prescription trends, making sure that the patient has an appropriate diagnosis that would make GLP-1s appropriate, right? They can't be I'm making up a ridiculous scenario, but they can't be like an influencer who wants to make some money off of a brand deal. So they go in asking for GLPs that they're going to promote, and they're going to get a kickback from the company for promoting it. Again, this is a ridiculous scenario that has not happened. You want to make sure that there's a medical necessity for the drug. And then again, those refill in patterns that are inconsistent or don't match clinical guidelines. So somebody that's trying to refill
Mhm.
every 2 weeks instead of every 30 days, or whatever the refill frequency is. I think that's something else. Documentation, I mentioned that earlier. Telehealth providers making sure they're prescribing appropriately where they're supposed to
Ooh.
be, if they're licensed to prescribe in a state, and all of a sudden they start prescribing in some other state, that could be a red flag. And again, I go back to clinical guidelines, making sure those are all appropriate.
Okay. Fair enough. And in the time you mentioned kickbacks, and I'd like to explore that a little bit and what kickbacks might look like in the GLP space. This is clearly a risk more than others.
Yeah. As you both probably know, in the prescription space and pharmacy, there is a set of rebates that are already in place under the 340B guidelines. But drug manufacturers have occasionally offered additional incentives to providers if they prescribe their medications, right? And that's well documented, well known. That's not some backroom secret. Although there is some increased scrutiny around offering an incentive around prescribing a GLP-1 and making sure, again, if you're offering a GLP-1 that's already in high demand, that's supposed to be and I'm going to use some colloquial language, so apologies, but a magical weight loss drug, and then you're magically offering an incentive, and all of a sudden, after a drug rep visits, your prescribing trends for that drug suddenly increase and your rebate money comes in, that can be a big compliance concern. And when claims come into health plans, they need to look at that trend as well, or offering significant discounts on obtaining the drugs. If you're, someone who brings the drugs in-house and you're offering a significant discount if they use your medication over another one, right? So those are things that I've also been seeing in the news and starting to see audit follow-up out of that, those abnormal discounts and rebates that are being offered.
And another part of the unfortunate part of the risk of kickback is, yet again, we are operating in an environment where patient is quite unaware, and I am willing to bet money that even the provider is unaware of which pharmacy things are going to come
Mhm.
from, but they do know what's coming from them. They know for a fact that if they receive an intake form and they do not approve the prescription, the patient 99% of the time is refunded their initial subscription or initial payment. So patients don't pay anything, which sounds fair, right? You should not be paying for something you're not buying, as if it's a dress. Well, the problem is that there's an inherent influence on the provider that you know for a fact that you get to continue to do your job as long as you prescribe this medication so the company can make money.
Yeah.
There is just the whole inherent, the business model here is in question
Yes.
because there is no way that it's not in question, because the only way that, hey, you the provider who has a prescribing power, whatever license level you're at, you get to do a, I'm going to say, remote work from home instead of bedside clinical work, which seems to be a preferable method of work anymore. And you get to do that, and the stability of your company is directly tied to prescriptions.
Well, I'd agree.
It's not patient and they will pay us for a visit anyways. 99% of these companies operate on the premise that you don't have to pay us anything if you're not approved. So how many companies, you tell me, are willing to pay providers X amount of dollars per hour for visits if they're never going to get paid?
Yeah.
Inherently, the business model is the what's baked into the business model is conflict of interest from, but by default. I
No,
don't know
it's
how
a
else to
great
put this, by
point. I hadn't
default.
thought about it that way. I really hadn't.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine? I'm sitting at home, me, the provider. I want to provide good care. I have good intentions. I am helping people, but I know for a fact that the stability of my job is directly tied to what I approve today. And the only thing I can approve, the only reason of the existence of my company is GLP-1.
Well, and there are also providers who take advantage of that too. They are only in it to make money. So I think, it's the business model that's in question. And I think you said it very well. There's an inherent conflict of interest, right? And
And there's no way to operate any other way.
those, I guess, are the organizations I'd like to see the FDA really scrutinize and have a look at. And I think they are, but really looking at those companies who are simply set up to make money off of giving prescriptions, but very specific prescriptions. And inherently, that feels like a kickback. Some might argue otherwise, but it feels like a relationship that needs, some reviewing, some risk management.
Hmm.
It's not to say that the model can't be used. I don't think that's what you're saying, but there are some inherent risks about the motivations.
There's an inherent risk. Right.
Yeah, about what's motivating the provider to actually prescribe.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add one other thing because Elvan brought it up and I didn't quite get to it under fraud, waste, and abuse, and that's code manipulation, where an item around GLPs might get coded as X when it should be Y, so that providers can
Yeah.
charge a different rate, that's more advantageous to them. So apologize. I meant to bring that up when I was talking about waste and abuse, but Elvan, you brought it around as a provider, so that is definitely something that you need to think about.
As compliance professionals, this is such a big area of risk. And I just want to maybe summarize what we're thinking. So, as compliance professionals, how do we manage the risks around GLP-1? I mean, it's an audit plan by itself, right? Looking at marketing, promotion, education, documentation, the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse, kickbacks, all of this. So, how do you, as an organization, whether you're a provider prescribing or you're a payer, any thoughts, ladies, about how you manage this risk and what kind of audit program you develop to manage it?
That's not an easy question. Yes. Why you come up with stuff like that at the end, huh?
No, it's not. It's horrible, isn't it? And that's why I said, like, GLP-1 could be an entire audit program by itself if you're looking at all of those things. But at the moment, it feels like it's such a substantial risk. So if you're doing your compliance risk
Hmm.
assessment,
Hmm.
first of all, GLP-1 should be on your organization's compliance risk assessment and really understanding what those risks are for your particular organization. And once you understand those risks, like any other risk assessment, being able to prioritize the likelihood and the impact and getting your risk score and being able to figure out what kind of risk this is, a high one, a medium, a low one, and then building your audit plan from there. Have either of you been involved in any kind of audits around GLP-1?
So not directly, but I will say that I was part of setting up quarterly claims reviews to look at some of the trending, some of the prescribing habits, and then the GLP that they were prescribed, that they understood their refill strategies, things like that. But it was at the very beginning stage, and it was not a very sophisticated scheme, if you will.
No, but I'm glad you said that because in my head, I had it as okay, there's this, you develop an audit plan specifically around GLP-1. But actually, there are many ways of putting controls around GLP-1s and auditing the use of GLP-1s. And you've made a really good point that you could include the audit of GLP-1 and monitoring of GLP-1s within audits and reviews of other systems. And I like that. That to me is another way of doing that. And I think that's an important piece of information to share.
I was just starting to set it up. We hadn't fully executed it, and I was transitioned to something else. So unfortunately, I didn't get the good results, but I do know I have seen in the news some other health plans doing those quarterly reviews, those claim reviews, and what they're seeing and starting to investigate from a program integrity or fraud, waste, and abuse perspective is exactly what we talked about earlier. Those inconsistent prescribing trends or those coding errors or claims, if they're over a certain dollar amount, in Medicaid in particular, they will put the claim on hold and look at it. Because it's considered a high cost and they want to make sure that all the documentation, including prior authorization, step therapy, etc., are all on file. And they are seeing some cases where prescribers are pushing through claims that haven't they don't have the prior authorization or they don't have the step therapy documentation. And but health plans are also trying to control the cost of these drugs to the best of their ability, especially in Medicaid and CHIP, where you're stewards of government dollars, right? So taxpayer dollars. So it's really important that you spend every dollar wisely and appropriately.
I didn't realize that. I'm actually quite, maybe I shouldn't be, and I'm being naive, but actually examine that patient's claim and the medical records and everything before issuing that prior auth. That I think is interesting and actually really good for everyone to know. Okay, is there anything else we want to talk about on the GLP-1 front?
No, it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. We just on a more commercial information side of it. Both of the big manufacturers, the non-compounded, the DOGs, have dropped their prices. So we know that the item is here to stay. I think the next 6 months to a year is really going to show us how the regulators deal with the usage and which companies really stand the test of time doing what's right.
And I'd agree with that. I think that the scrutiny, because of the costs involved, the scrutiny is not going anywhere. And in fact, you're getting FDA scrutiny, you're going to have OIG scrutiny, you're going to have payers doing scrutiny, and there are some checks and balances, certainly on the payer side. And we'll have to watch the developments for these small companies, these telehealth companies in particular, or companies that are just set up to prescribe. I think there's going to be a lot more scrutiny there. I feel like payers are almost self scrutinizing because of the cost involved, but there's going to be some tension there. This doesn't go away. So, for those of us who work in the compliance space, I think it's worth definitely, and I think Elvan and Lorie would agree here. You need to be keeping your eye on the regulatory developments as they affect, GLP-1s. Obviously, we have a lot of regulatory change in the healthcare space anyway, but GLP-1 is going to be, I think, particularly challenging because there's so much of a demand and the manufacturers want to keep producing, patients want to keep consuming, and there's going to be this balance and this tension. And a lot for certainly compliance professionals to be assessing and figuring out, what's the best way of auditing and monitoring the use of these drugs. I think there's a lot of potential to review them and audit them in many different ways and just figuring out what's the most suitable means of monitoring and auditing for your particular organization. That's where we are with GLP-1s. Hopefully, those of you who are listening will have, found some new information there to help guide you in your compliance activities. As always, if you have any feedback about the show, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your thoughts, good, bad, and in between. And on that note, Elvan, Lorie, and I will sign off until next time. All right, everyone, take care.